Welcome to the Peer 150 webinar series. I am Mike Kaiser, co-founder of the Peer 150, and today I'm joined by Krista Manning, Director of Human Capital Management Innovation at Ultimate Software, Tracy Laney, the SVP and CHRO at Levi Strauss, and Frank Rutarte, the SVP and HR at Kaiser Permanente. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Before we get started, just want to do a couple housekeeping notes. For the Peer 150 webinar series, you can go to our website, peer150.com, click on the webinar series tab, and you can see all of the upcoming webinars as well as past webinars where we have links to the recordings if you missed one. So please visit there if you're looking for future webinars or want to hear one of our past webinars. Also want to thank our partners for the webinar series. First of all, I'd like to thank Ultimate Software, who partners with us not only on this specific webinar series and other webinars that we've had, but also our live events. Thank you very much, Ultimate Software. Also want to thank First Tech Credit Union, who has been fantastic in supporting us in this webinar initiative, and also supports the Peer 150 mission with the connection to all of our members. So thank you so much, First Tech, again, for your support. Finally, just a quick note on the Zoom platform. If you'd like to ask the panel a question, you can use the Q&A section. If you see a question on there that you would like answered, you can upvote that question. Those questions will bubble to the top, and I will try to get to as many of those as possible. So again, thank you all for joining us. Frank, Krista, and Tracy, thank you again for joining us. I'd like to just start out with a quick introduction, a little bit about your background and role in the organization you're with. So Tracy, let's start with you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Tracy Laney. I am the CHRO for Levi Strauss & Company. I've actually been with Levi's only since March 23rd. So we can talk about if you want today or another day about onboarding virtually, because 100% of my onboarding to this company has been virtual. I'm sure everyone knows what Levi Strauss is. We'll talk a little bit. We're a very, very global company. We have we see a wholesale business, a retail business, distribution centers, corporate teams. And so we can get into some of that today. Prior to Levi's, I was the Chief HR Officer for Shutterfly, where I spent 5 years running that organization. And then before that, I spent 10 years at Gap. So sort of deep retail and then e-commerce background. Began my career in consulting, so I kind of come with a strategy point of view to HR. But yeah, here we find ourselves, and really excited to be at Levi's, even during these difficult times, and happy to share kind of what we've learned so far as we think about returning to the office and just managing through this time.
Thank you, Tracy. Frank.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So Frank Rutarte, Senior Vice President, Human Resources for the Southern California market. So if you're in California, everybody's really familiar with Kaiser. Overall, we're in about 8 regions with over 220,000 employees. Our Southern California region is Bakersfield through San Diego, and we've got about 75,000 employees, 15 hospitals, and 250 medical centers. So pretty large organization and operation. And in terms of just our kind of current environment, we are, like everybody else, trying to figure this out as we go. And we're not perfect, but I think we have some good learnings that we can share today with everybody on the call. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank. Krista.
Sure, thanks Mike for coming, and Tracy and Frank for joining me. I spent most of my career actually as an industry analyst, most recently at Burson, and did work at AMR, which was bought by Gartner Group. So really researching all the HR software and service providers in the industry and workforce-facing technologies and strategies. My role now at Ultimate is to continue to follow market trends, really looking at particularly the intersection of artificial intelligence and digital technologies and transformation in the future of work. And so I've been spending a lot of time researching how people have reacted to the pandemic. And then certainly I have a lot of experience in terms of what Ultimate has done as we are a global organization responding as well.
Thank you, Krista. So I thought, this is a fantastic topic. I really love it. We've kind of gone through a lot of iterations. Everybody's sort of, I guess, in place a little bit with what their current situation is. We're going to be talking about what is your vision of re-emergence and how are you handling it? And I thought it might be a good place to start is to talk just real quickly about where you were at as far as maybe your work at home force prior to the stay-at-home orders, where you're at now, and then just kind of an overall geography about, what kind of areas are you dealing with? And then I think we'll dive more into some of the challenges around that. But I thought it might be good just to kind of say, we were here and now we're here, to give the audience a little bit of a level set. So Tracy, can you kind of describe, when you came in, what the dynamic was within the organization and kind of where you've landed as of today?
Sure, absolutely. So a couple things I just want to say, I think, and I know we'll hear this from Frank too, we have a very diverse workforce in terms of type of people, type of work. We have folks who work in our stores, folks who work in our distribution centers. We have a teeny bit of our own manufacturing, but sort of DC and manufacturing, and then we have corporate. And so I think that's just important, and we're global, right? So I think even when you think about return to office or return to, this type of thing, I think you have to think about, like, by the time I joined the company in March, China had been out and they were back in the office, right? In different ways, right? I think so. We've been in this rolling period where we've had to think through, safety and security in stores and distribution and manufacturing, and then in corporate, right? And it's not what we've learned is you want strong guidelines, but not a one size fits all. In terms of working at home for a corporate workforce, I think it was, we valued flexibility, but it was pretty small. I think it was, I think like most companies, maybe 10%, maybe 15%. It was something that the company, as I understand it, had been thinking about, but hadn't really come out with a point of view. Again, even in that context, there's very important global differences, cultural norms, things like that. And so I think we're not unlike a lot of companies that look like us in that, we have this different kind of workforce. And also we were, this was sort of on our plate to think about, but literally overnight, as we all did, our corporate employees went from working in the office most of the time to not being in the office at all. And now we're trying to figure out, which we'll talk about today, kind of what that go forward plan is.
Thanks, Tracy. And I think, Frank, you had kind of a similar situation where you were not a highly work from home environment, and I guess now you are. Could you talk a little bit about that transition for yourself?
Yeah, so we've healthcare in general, I've been in healthcare for over 20 years, is a very relationship driven industry. And I'm going to say 90+% of our employees worked in an office, on a hospital, or a medical office building. And so what we're finding is, with all of the various, stay-at-home orders and things of that nature, and ramping down of services, there's certain functions that we were able to move virtually. Most of our corporate functions were, 90% in the office. Now, I'm going to say maybe 5-10% are in the office now, if that. We've moved a lot of our care to virtual in our medical office buildings. A lot of our primary care visits are now telehealth. So we looked at it from what's business critical and what's non-business critical. And so that's kind of how we organized, but we were very face-to-face, really. And I'll say that we are, COVID has really created this burning platform for us. And that's really has pushed us to this more virtual organization that, we probably wouldn't have been in this state for maybe another 5 years. So this is really a burning platform for us to really move our staff and our care virtual, and then rethink some of our strategies in terms of capital and things of that nature.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, I'm guessing that, Frank and Tracy's situations where they currently sit are fairly typical, but what are you seeing out there with other companies? Are they, did they move fully to virtual, and how did they make that decision you're seeing on what to keep or what to bring back to an office? What's kind of the trends that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, so I think it obviously does depend on the industry. So as a high-tech company, we're 40% remote, and I think a lot of the high-tech companies were able to go, and a lot of them have come out and said that they'll remain remote. But we also have hourly workers. We have individuals who have to go and print paychecks for the essential workers. And I think what we saw is a lot of companies had to really dig deep and think, who are essential employees? How could you actually identify what they had to do and go in and even maybe give documentation to have along in case they got stopped. So I think it's a whole mix, and people will continue to kind of reflect and think about, when can they make people digital and virtual? And then to what extent, when people want to, they'll make some flexibility of when they return to offices.
Thanks, Krista. So, one of the questions where I wanted to start was, and Tracy and Frank, you guys both mentioned it within your organizations, is, there's challenges around reopening when you have a wide geography as part of your footprint for your organization. You might have some international offices, certainly probably have some domestic offices, states that are opening up earlier, maybe some mindsets that are different within your states and organizations. So I want to start with geography. Tracy, what are you doing with the reopening, and how are you dealing with geographical differences that may exist right now?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And one of the things that we've done, especially led by sort of our security team, right? The person who's been on point for us to a large extent, although working closely with HR, is our head of security. And this was from the very beginning. I think everyone knows it's easier to close things than to open them. I mean, not easy in all ways. We had to make sure we had great, we use Microsoft Teams and technology and things like that. But we basically created sort of a playbook for reopening. There's specific ones for offices, there's specific ones for stores, that we have global guidelines, but then there's individuals, there's sort of people, the regions and even the countries can make those more specific. One of the things I think is very important, you mentioned, so we've been basically following kind of around the globe, sort of the government sort of directives for the most part. One thing I would say, particularly I think in the US, because we've seen such disparate guidance and sort of standards, even if you will, by state or by locality and municipality, we've actually decided to make our own decisions. And this actually applies much more to our stores, where they're much more decentralized than offices. We have a headquarters in San Francisco. We have other large footprint of offices in the States, but really we have stores in dozens and dozens of counties across the US. To use that as an example, we basically are doing our own assessment. So we hired an epidemiologist out of the gate to work with. We have our own council, and we basically evaluate our sort of the safety of any location based upon our own metrics, which are the metrics that you hear health officers talk about too, like caseload, hospitalization, all that. It's nothing unique. But we learned pretty early on that we probably couldn't get the level of guidance from the government, at least in this country and in other countries as well, but certainly in the US, it was so inconsistent that we set our own guidelines. And so every week we look at that, and that drives our decision on a store reopening, for instance, and it drives our decision to some degree on office. The one thing I will say, where we have government restrictions, some of you may know, if you're in the Bay Area, San Francisco still has very tight restrictions on office opening. And that is driving kind of our decision. Even we had to let the organization know that we're not going to open our main headquarters until at least after Labor Day in the US, because we just don't have any confidence that we're going to be able to do that between now and then anyway, and people needed to plan their lives for the summer and childcare and things like that. So that's basically how we've done it. We basically have taken our own experts to help us make these decisions.
Thanks, Tracy. And Frank, can you talk a little bit about the geographical challenges that you're facing with, reopening in certain states or certain countries or certain regions?
So I can speak to Southern California because that's my market. And I think what Tracy is saying is you get mixed messages from the state, and even from the county. So in Southern Cal, LA County says one thing, Orange County says another, and San Diego has another. So you get lots of mixed messages, and then you get for us, regulatory bodies give you another message. So we really, we have physicians, so we look at the science. And we've made a decision that, we're not really in a hurry to bring everybody back. We've actually put a stake in the ground and said, everybody who's working from home now, stay there till July 31st. Because what we find is we're really struggling, or our challenge is really around a couple factors. One is psychological safety. There's that fear. Then there's the science. Then there's the actual supply. Right, the PPE, and I know you probably, Tracy, you guys think about that, PPE and the protective gear. And then the other piece is the physical safety. How are you going to have everybody come back into an office and feel safe? And so those are some of the factors that we've been talking about. There's no way we can bring everybody in and think we're going to social distance. So we are not, as Tracy mentioned for her organization, we're not in a hurry to bring everybody back. We want to take our time, because we want people to stay safe. This virus is very unknown, right? And so everybody is out wearing masks and things of that nature. So we're okay with moving a lot of things virtual in the care space where we can, keeping our corporate employees out, and then really focusing on what I said earlier, what are our business critical functions that we have to deliver.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, Tracy and Frank bring up a great point in that messages coming are inconsistent about what you should do, right? it would be easy enough to say, hey, here's the directive from the CDC, or here's the government directives, or here's the state and local directives. But when they're constantly changing and they're not consistent, that's really difficult. Do you have any advice for, what should you be doing as far as reopening certain states earlier than others, trying to stay consistent with your messages? Do you have any thoughts around, for the executives out there, what do you do?
I think one of the things I really picked up on in talking to companies is it is all about kind of creating a two-way communication with the employees. So kind of getting a sense of what they're doing, what they want, what they're comfortable with, and then consistently kind of communicating out what the company is going to do. Just like Levi's, Ultimate's going to stay closed until after Labor Day. I think a lot of companies, if they can, have said, please stay home, make plans with your family, and to the extent you want to come in, we will start to evaluate and then follow the general guidelines around PPE and social distancing, maybe swapping shifts. I do think that it is more about what individuals are comfortable with and what company cultures kind of give people the flexibility to have, more so than any consistent way of tackling it state by location. And again, like these organizations, we have locations in Europe and in Asia, and kind of watching to see what's happening there and what some of the first steps or tactics are. But it really has to be, I think, a company culture kind of driven decision.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, I do want to get into the company culture because I do think that's a big topic, and it helps guide you a little bit in what you should do. Before we get off this topic, though, Tracy, when you're looking at potentially opening certain offices based on geography or lines of business and keeping other things closed, that can be a really difficult message for some employees. You may have some employees in a line of business that say, hey, I want to get back at it. I want to get back in the office. And you're saying, well, no, that line of business we're not doing. Or, even more is, an office or a store in, Georgia or Florida that tend to be opening faster versus, the Bay Area. How are you handling those kinds of decisions and then the communication around that to the organization?
Such a good question. I think this is actually where some of the lines of sort of roles come into play, right? So from a store perspective, it is very localized, right? So we've had to sort of make those decisions locally. We also had to make the hard decision to furlough employees, right? So during this period, for employees were furloughed, and so as we've called people back, we've been in active dialogue with our employees in the field. We call it the field, the stores, to really assess sort of people's readiness to come back, their willingness to come back, what do they want to come back. We have a lot of concerns, especially in certain parts of the country, with public transportation. I think we haven't quite dealt with all of that yet as much as we need to, because like New York isn't back online, for instance, as a place where people really take public transit. So we have specific issues there. So we are, we're kind of in active dialogue. We've been actively surveying employees up and down, and we do a regular kind of one with our store employees to just kind of assess sentiment. I will tell you, what we're learning now is that it's very stressful for frontline employees. I think anyone who has employees in hospitality, as restaurants reopen or as retail stores, they're still constrained. The business isn't back, so they've got constrained payroll. They're having to do many more activities, cleaning, they're wearing a mask all day. So we are listening to what they're telling us, right? I just found out yesterday that we're debating if we keep a mask or if we go to face shields, because those actually are deemed to be more comfortable, I think, for long periods of time. And we're evaluating their efficacy. And I think we're hearing good things. I'm sure Frank knows way more about that than I do. But that's something we just want to be very responsive. From an office perspective, this is really where, and I'm sure we'll get into this dovetails into what's our long-term strategy from flexibility, what's our long-term real estate portfolio, honestly. And we've sort of put a stake in the ground. We actually did a piece of work in addition to sort of surveying employees. We identified different groups of employees, people whose jobs 100%, or 90% need to be in the office, to, that's one bucket, to people at points in time. For instance, when folks work with product, physically with product, that's been much harder for them to do remotely, as one example. People who might want to be there for key meetings, or then, folks who really need it for engagement. The other thing I would not overlook is that we are hearing from a lot of employees, they're really struggling with mental health. And there are employees who are, especially our younger employees, who might live with their parents, live with their roommates, would die to get back in the office next week if we gave them that choice. So we can't, I think the lesson is there's not one size fits all. We also don't know people's personal, medical concerns or family concerns. And so our general point of view for offices has been, we're not going to force anybody to go back. I mean, potentially not until there's even a vaccine. Like, we're not going to be in a position, like, certain roles are required, but we feel like it's such a small percent of our corporate workforce that we can work through that. And so that's where we are sort of looking at this as a more holistic workforce problem. How do we think about office, how it interplays with home, and how do we support the well-being of all of our employees, but in our corporate employees in particular, as they navigate both work at home, which has its own set of challenges, let's be honest, and work in the office. And that's kind of where we are now, and imagining what the next, honestly, couple of years could look like.
Thanks, Tracy. And Frank, I know that you've had the caregiver side of it that has sort of continued on with the social distancing and a lot of those kind of things. But as you mentioned, your office environment is remote now. When you're looking at bringing those folks back, again, the consistent message of who comes back and when, how are you handling that?
Yeah, so, I think, like Tracy, I would say our medical office buildings are like retail as well. So we have a mix, right, of corporate and our medical services. And so we know that we're not going to come back in the same manner that we were in the past, meaning we're not going to have 100% of our buildings full. We've talked about, what would our capacity look like? Maybe if we do come back, we would only be at a 50% capacity, because there's so much unknown with this virus. We've got recently we have 220,000 employees across all of our organization, and we recently just sent everybody 3 what we call cover your cough masks, so they can wear those in the community and at work. So there's just a lot of unknown, but we do know that we're not in a hurry to bring people back. We do know that we're not going to be at the same capacity, because we need to rethink our capital. We need to rethink our virtual. Before COVID, in our medical office buildings, if you think about a Kaiser, if you ever walked into a clinic, you have pharmacy, lab, imaging, and physicians, right? And some of that work can go virtual. We maybe were, I'm going to say 10, 15% virtual. Now we're like 90% virtual for primary care. So there's some services that we know we're not going to bring back 100%. And so we're really working through that. We do have playbooks for us in SoCal. We have a regional governance. So we go for our locations, county by county, they have different regulations and rules. And so we have a governance that decides, okay, which offices will open, which offices will close. We do have a smaller footprint in terms of our corporate office in Pasadena, as an example. And we are just taking our time. One of the things that we really started to look at is a concept of a 2, 6, and a 12. What will the organization look like in 2 months? What will it look like in 6 months? What will it look like in 12 months? So we're putting that framework in place so that we can have a very concrete approach to either bringing the workforce back, keeping them out virtual, and then kind of what are the things that go with that. So I think our framework of 2, 6, 12 is serving us well as we think through our new reality.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, I think, Frank and Tracy's comments, I think, summarize kind of a lot of what HR executives are dealing with. Is there isn't a one size fits all in this, right? I mean, deciding what line of business to bring back or what geography to bring back and how do you communicate that can be a real challenge. And then that challenge around people that may want to come back, as Tracy, mentioned, is you've got people that, the workplace was their social, piece, and they want to come back, where others are totally fine with working at home, right? So how do you manage that, as Frank talks about, you have a game plan for who you want to come back, but some people within that division may not want to come back, some may want to. How do you deal with all this in a structured way?
Well, I think they both touched on this, but doing, employee surveys and understanding their sentiment and being able to kind of slice and dice that data and understand what populations may have certain preferences, but then complement that with training and preparing managers to have authentic conversations around, what do you need, what do you want, what are you, facing at home, I think has been one of the things that really has resonated most.
Thanks. And just another follow-up on that, let's say, because I think this situation is probably going to happen within organizations, is you have a manager that says, hey, this line of business is open, we're open in our office, and there's folks that report to that person that say, hey, I'm not comfortable coming in, right? I don't feel safe. I'm not. How would you how would you deal with that situation, or what's some advice you have for our HR executives that might have to maybe have a tough conversation with that manager to say, hey, here's what we support. And I know you mentioned, you know, and again, we'll get more into it, but you mentioned culture may help in those kind of discussions. What's your advice for those kind of situations though, where you have that kind of conflict?
You know, I think everyone's going through this right now, right? Like, how can you make sure that you're compliant with duty of care at the same time you're compassionate? And I do think to some extent you have to give the people flexibility. We do a lot of research into equity at work, and you know, different people are comfortable being on video versus being on an audio call. I think it's just really, you know, doubling down on some of your leadership training and your communication strategy training around how to listen better, how to use some tools so that you can do analysis and show executives, here's what people are saying, here are the trends, so they can make decisions to support resources, whether it's providing more well-being support or well-being programs to supplement or augment what it is that people want to either come back or to stay productive at home.
Thanks,
Can I
Krista.
jump into that question for a minute? Because I think one of the things that we've talked about is, it depends on the role. I mentioned that already, but I think a guiding principle, I would say, is if someone's been able to do their job effectively for the last 60, 70 days, you're gonna have a very hard time convincing me that just because you want to be back in the office or you think that's the default in this pandemic time we're still in, that's gonna be a requirement. Like, I'm not sympathetic to that point of view. And I think you have to say that, right? If you're gonna say it, you have to say, look, and by the way, we all know for certain, very few, I mean, I'm sure some exceptions, but very few exceptions, people aren't gonna be at there every day anyway, because you can't fit them with social distancing and things like that. You're gonna be at least half, if not smaller than that. So, so that's just something I think this is an area where HR actually has a strong voice and has been playing a strong role for these last few months, and should not shy away from that, right? I mean, I think that we're all waking up and saying that 5 days in the office in the way it used to be is probably not going to be the default for a very, very long time. And so how do you navigate through that? And I think manager preference is not really a reason to ask people to come back in the office. And so it's more helping them, to Krista's good point, of like, how do you have that conversation of how we're going to live in this period together for a period of time, knowing you even have employees have specific situations that you may not know and shouldn't be known, right? So that's, I think that's an area where just saying, look, you know, that, and again, not every job falls into that. I've got people who have to be in stores, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that's a one size fits all, but for most of the corporate teams, if people have been productive, I think, you know, allowing a high degree of flexibility is what's going to be required for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, that was a question early on around productivity. So we did a workforce study around productivity, and we found that actually people working from home were probably more productive than when coming into the office. So, you know, with the drive and the commute and the logistics and things of that nature, we actually found people were more productive. And so I would suggest, if you're not doing some type of a survey your teams, your managers and things of that nature, and use the data, right, to inform the decision. Because you get managers who are saying, oh, I need to see the whites of your eyes, and that's always how it's been, but that's just not our reality anymore. I actually read something around, it's not work from home anymore, it's work from anywhere. So really, I would, you know, really encourage, use the data in your organization to really inform the decision.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, I wanted to go to you with one of the questions from the audience. And we've had this question before, and I'm just interested in folks' perspectives is, you know, when we talk about the productivity and we say, hey, folks are more productive at home, and you know, that is a good barometer for, you know, how should we bring them back, or, you know, what's their situation. But what about that employee that's not more productive at home? They might have some home life things that are distracting them. They may just not be as motivated, and you know, things that like that. How do you deal with that person that says, hey, I don't want to come in right now because of my safety concerns, which may be real, but you also have a productivity issue with them being at home, and especially if it's substantially different than what they did before the stay-at-home orders. How would you deal with that situation?
Well, I have studied sort of the concept of productivity in the workplace, particularly with knowledge workers, and it's hard to measure, right? And so sometimes organizations will subjectively measure, ask the employees, do you feel like you've been more productive? So I think you really have to drill down on, well, why do you think this person is not being more productive? I mean, sometimes it's very simple, but I think, HR has done a lot of work the last couple of years really reflecting on performance management. A lot of the ways we measure performance are actually incredibly biased. It's really based on lots of different, just over 200 human biases, right? And they all come to play potentially in measuring performance, and productivity is an aspect of performance unless it's very literal output divided by hours worked, right? So again, I think you have to really drill into what is the contributions of people. Are they behaving? A lot of organizations now are starting to look at key behavioral indicators. Are you supporting our culture and our values during this time? And so maybe it's okay if you back off some of the traditional measures of productivity or performance that organizations have had. So I think, again, it's really more about reflecting what is our organization doing, what is our purpose, what is our mission and vision and values, and can we support our employees through this tremendous, pressure cooker. And so I would suggest that this person kind of reflect and try to have a conversation with executives. What other data do we have, or information, or sources of insight, like a survey and employee perspectives, that we can bring to bear to not really have to knuckle down and judge that person on one particular metric. But it is strictly, certainly, when you have to look at things like balancing the work and the demand.
Right. Tracy, I wanted to get to another audience question, because you experienced this, right? They were asking, starting March 23rd at Levi, you were onboarded virtually, in a sense, onboarding yourself. But how are you dealing with the onboarding training process for new employees virtually? And what's been your experience on the success of that, or challenges around that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think in some ways we're still early days, because I'm going to say something that I'm sure it doesn't apply to other organizations, but a lot of organizations are also hiring less, right? We're hiring less. So you actually have less sort of volume of this coming in. And so to really assess how we're doing, I think it's going to take us a little bit of time. I mean, we've overnight moved everything, new employee orientation, all of the onboarding activities to virtual. I'd say we've amplified them. We've actually invested probably more than you would typically see in sort of overt onboarding to the company, we're giving employees this extra support. I think the part that's hard, and even I'm feeling this, and I've been, obviously in this role immersed, right? I mean, it's been, as everyone on this call, to some 24/7, even though it's in a virtual environment. I'm blessed. I met folks during the interview process, and I happened to go into the office a few weeks before I was, I actually started. So I got to meet people, but it's still, a fraction of what it would normally have been. And I think the biggest thing I'm worried about is sort of is the loss of the kind of intangibles, right? The loss of the hallway conversations and starting to see people. Yes, I see people online, and so I'm making faces and names, and that's helpful. But I think coming up on 3 months, you start to miss that. And so I feel like we can do a very good job on kind of the brass tacks of getting people onboarded. I think we're helping managers through this as well, through some manager training on onboarding. That's in a virtual world, which is very different. The piece that I think we still have yet to see is what is sort of the long-term implication. What happens with attrition? What happens with people feeling engaged in things like that as they've come into a company? And I think that is what I worry a little bit about, to be honest, because I don't think we're going to know that right away. I think we'll know it pretty soon. And it's just the loss of literally the proverbial water cooler catch up, right? And that's something I'm definitely keeping an eye on.
Thanks, Tracy. And Frank, I wanted to get your perspectives on your onboarding process and what you're seeing there virtually.
Yeah, I think the same as Tracy. One of the things we put a stake in the ground as well as our hiring volumes down, but that was also intentional, so we didn't have to furlough or lay off. So we went through a very rigorous enhanced position control process here. And what we ended up doing in some of those medical office buildings that we did consolidate services, we created labor pools. And we were able to redistribute people within the services that were still open. So our services are continuing to kind of retract and reenter and things of that nature, but our volume is down. But we've moved everything to virtual, from new employee orientation to leadership development training programs to town halls and things of that nature. But the one thing that what Tracy said that really resonated with me is in this, COVID, and I think of it as it's not a post-COVID world. We have to think of it as living with COVID. Until until a vaccine is introduced, we have to live with it. People are talking about pre and post. This is actually living with it. And the thing that I think about is as you move your workforce more virtual is that you got to keep that connectivity, right? So that you talked about the water cooler. So don't lose that, right? So continue to have the one-on-ones, continue to have the team meetings, but do it virtual. So, we are doing a lot around connectivity and communication and town halls. We're not overwhelming people, but we're informing because there's a lot of unknown and fear. So it really makes me think that, we've, again, 90% face-to-face. This is a new reality for us in terms of our services that we provide medically, going virtual, our corporate offices. But, as we think through this, living with COVID, it's what is that connectivity, and help your managers and leaders kind of manage through that. Just because they're virtual doesn't mean you should, not connect in the same ways that you did maybe when they were in the office.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, I think when Frank and Tracy talk about that onboarding process, and you had mentioned culture earlier, I really think that bringing on somebody new, culture is a lot about that face-to-face water cooler discussions. It's built over time, and that can be a really powerful recruiting tool for companies. When you bring on somebody virtually, I'm guessing culture is really hard to instill with Zoom calls and things like that. But what are you seeing there, and what are some ideas that you can give that might help with continuing the culture with new hires and new employees?
I was just reflecting because I've actually worked for 3 different companies that were recognized as top places to work as a virtual employee, and gone through virtual onboarding. But then quickly you have some type of in-face kind of orientation. And Ultimate has actually had a very intense, week in Florida where you spend all day with a cohort and you go out to eat and really build connections all across the organization. And that was a big anxiety for us as we had everybody go remote. But I think one unique thing that we've had that really struck me was there's a virtual employee community of interest that was already an entity at Ultimate that was able to bring a lot of their best practices to bear right away. And I think thinking about a virtual employee as a cohort or as a persona, when you think reimagine the employee experience, we used to have live events in regional cities to kind of complement that face-to-face connection and socialization. We'd have birthday cakes for everybody who had a birthday that quarter or whatever. I think you have to be deliberate about that and make it a program, right? So we have Zooms for women in technology, and then you can have a breakout based on the age of your children. Like, you have to actually come up with a proactive program for the virtual experience to really recover from whatever in-person kind of cultural norms you had, and even go beyond now by saying we're in a totally different world. So personally, I can say I can see that has been a best practice and has helped sustain Ultimate through this transition, and that more companies probably should be really deliberate about what does our culture mean, and within the restraints or restrictions that we can do. We got sent pajama bottoms for virtual employees after the COVID started, like flannel pants. Really try to be creative. Like, how can you really establish that relationship with your employees and sustain it over time in a totally different way, but that fits with the culture that you might have had, like your cough masks at Kaiser, right? Like you're reaching out to them at home and providing them something that's like a personal touch for their work and their personal lives, I think is a great example.
Thanks, Krista. Tracy, I want to take a step back because there's a great question here and it's related to essential roles and in an office or an environment. And I think you might have a good perspective. I want to get your perspective too, Frank. But Tracy, let's say you have somebody at a retail store that is essential. They need to be there, right? They need to be, they're at the front desk or whatever they are. And they don't feel safe or don't feel comfortable coming in dealing with the public. Are you, the question is, are you laying them off? Are you, giving them a severance package? Are you suggesting they resign? What do you do with that person? Because the fear is real. It's not like they're just making this up. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And we had a little bit of this. We haven't you'd be surprised, more people want to come back than don't. And so I think it's interesting to use the retail example. I'm going to give my answer there, but I want to think about corporate too, because we've talked about this. From a retail perspective, unfortunately, most of our store employees have been on some sort of furlough, and this is true globally. The stores closed, they were furloughed. That means they're already collecting unemployment. You know, they're still getting, if they're benefits eligible, still getting benefits. And so we have, and as those of you in the US teams know, right now they have enhanced unemployment. And so we've been very, very flexible in saying, look, if you're not comfortable coming back, in some cases they're actually making more than if they, you know, came back. And so I think that's been helping us for a while. I think that's, and I mean helping, I mean like it's giving them a lot of sort of income continuation, and it's, you know, and therefore ability to kind of see if they're comfortable in the situation. Some of that's going to end at this point unless Congress acts by the end of July. So I think we'll have to deal with that then. But it's actually been a pretty small percentage of people who are uncomfortable. A lot of times what they're uncomfortable is less about the job, but about the transportation. And so then we're also getting creative to say, look, we'll reimburse an Uber. We'll do things like that, things that we normally wouldn't do if that's the barrier. On the corporate side, this almost goes back to what we talked about. I mean, there are so few jobs in a corporate office that need to be in the office, right? Most of them are in the facilities world or something like that. And to be honest, most of them have already been there throughout because they've been considered essential throughout, and most, even by most municipality standards. And so I know a lot of leaders want to go answer this question, and it doesn't mean it's not a valid question. It definitely is a valid question, especially in like a DC or a store. I actually think it's less of a question in corporate, and usually what's the question behind the question is what we talked about earlier, which is I want them back, as opposed to they need to come back. So in those cases, we've sort of said, like, we're not going to write some blanket policy about that, because we actually think those are case by case and should be handled with human resources and leaders, so that we're not setting up a situation where people feel like they aren't given a choice, right? So again, it's back to the same theme. You have to look at your population and make the right assessment.
And Frank, you know, your perspectives on that kind of a situation where you have maybe a caregiver that's not comfortable coming back, yet you need that role. How would you handle that?
So, you know, when COVID hit the United States significantly, we had high absenteeism rates because of the fear. And so, you know, we have really great benefits here. And so we dealt through the absenteeism, and then, you know, we again surveyed our employees, you know, what are they looking for? What are their feedback? What can we do? And some of the things that, you know, we put a stake in the ground, right? We're not furloughing, we're not laying off. We created labor pools. We have alternative work assignments. We also have created enhanced benefits for people to use. With one of the things that we found is it wasn't necessarily they couldn't come back, but because all the daycares were closed, they didn't have daycare. So we found daycare resources, and we've offered stipends for daycare. We've gotten creative with additional leaves, and then the masks. So really, the question you have to ask yourself is what type of employer do you want to be, right, during this crisis? So I mean, there's a lot going on, not only just with the COVID, but the civil unrest. And then I think a lot of employers are saying, okay, what type of employer do I want to be? How can I be creative? How can I support the workforce and things of that nature? So again, high absenteeism in the beginning, and then as people started feeling comfortable, we started seeing the absenteeism go down. That was mostly in our medical office buildings and our hospitals. In our corporate, as Tracy said, you know, if you can do the job from home, we're literally saying just stay, because we're not prepared to provide that, you know, physical safety, right? You know, how many people can be in an elevator? Where are the, you know, the distributions for the hand sanitizer? Just things, how often are you going to clean? You know, if you just think about like the psychological safety I talked about, you know, a lot of organizations in corporate, they clean at night when everybody's gone. Well, we're hearing from our staff, they actually want to see people cleaning during the day. So there's a lot of logistics you have to put in place for your corporate offices. But it really gets back, you know, for me as a leader in our organization to say, you know, what kind of employer do you want to be? And then you have to put those kind of measures in place.
Thanks, Frank. And Krista, Frank brought up some good points on, you know, psychological safety and getting folks to, you know, be comfortable with coming back to an office. And, you know, we know until there's a vaccine, there's a risk, right? You can't eliminate everything. But what are some things that companies can do? You know, is it temperature checks on the way in? Is it wearing masks? You know, obviously the social distancing of 6 feet. What are some things that companies can do to help with that psychological safety, so that you can minimize the issue of a critical person, that a role that needs to come in that doesn't want to come in because they don't feel safe.
You know, the psychological safety term kind of can be literal and figurative. So I think it originally came out of teams that were high functioning in high tech companies that actually could be honest and take risks and not fear failure. So I think that companies can even flip that concept back and say to their employees, we're all working through this together. We have to figure out what are the different mechanisms going to work for our location, our industry, our part of the world. And then again, like create those two-way dialogues around, tell us what you're concerned about. We will be able to tell you what we're doing to mitigate them, and hopefully come to some kind of humane compromise that's fairly and consistently executed across the company. We like to kind of think of a theme of the connected, compliant workforce. That's really what HR's kind of mission is now, to make sure people are connected to the resources and the relationships they need to thrive. And then are we making sure that we are capturing all the data, all of the information that we're going to need to be able to communicate to our executives, to report to the government, to prove to workers that they are getting the right benefits that they're entitled to, and that we're fulfilling our promise to them as employers in this, you know, the contract of the relationship. So, you know, I come back to the theme of flexibility and building this concept of trust. But again, that also gets to what is your company culture, and what are you wanting to be known for coming out of this crisis, because the next crisis will come along. And that's what we really need HR professionals to be thinking of. How can you prepare for this at scale in a digital virtual world?
Thanks, Chris. And Tracy, I wanted to get your perspectives, because being in the retail business, you probably have the perfect storm there, in a sense of how do you make people feel safe and secure? You know, it's one thing in a corporate office where you can kind of control who comes in and out, you can control that environment. In a retail store, you know, you can't, right? You have people coming in. And you mentioned, you know, face masks, you're looking at face shields. I'm really curious, I think you're kind of at the cutting edge of this. What are you doing within your stores to try to give those people, you know, not only your employees, but your customers, that psychological safety to come in and shop and feel like they're safe?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think, again, we've been saying we are grateful to our colleagues in China, because they were the first ones who had to deal with this. And we've been learning as we sort of reopen the globe. I think, you know, it's everything from posting our safety guidelines on our, you know, on our doors so our customers can see it. We do require face coverings, but, you know, to be honest, because that's issue's become a bit charged as well, we've also told our associates, our stylists, like, you know, you don't need to, you know, you could request it, but if a customer refuses to do it, we're not going to create, you know, we can't control that, because that could be another, to be honest, safety concern. Obviously, continued cleaning. You know, it's interesting, like we have a fitting room issue. And I think that the general thinking a few months ago was people don't want to use fitting rooms. Actually, that's not true. Customers are happy to use fitting rooms. We're doing things like quarantining the product people try on for 24 hours. We quarantine returns for 72 hours, all of those kinds of things. And so it's about sort of the visibility of that. But as I mentioned earlier, that adds to workload, right? You've got folks cleaning who were never doing that before in this kind of way. And the stress of it, and, you know, and how do you deal with customers who don't want to wear a mask or who aren't social distancing? And we do our best, we put marks on the ground, but if someone's not going to comply, you know, and I think that's where a lot of the sort of stress in that organization is coming from, that we're trying to mitigate. But I would say, you know, I think it surprised all of us how willing customers were to return to their old behavior, right? They aren't really showing up differently. Maybe there's less of them, because there are people who just aren't shopping and who are staying home, but like there are less of them, but the ones that are there want to be there. And that's good news for us. Obviously, we love our customers, but you know, I think everyone's still in this dance of figuring out how this is going to work. And we're just trying to keep, you know, our employees safe. And that means physically safe, but also physically safe from a customer who might get angry if they're asked to do something they don't want to do.
Hey, Tracy and Frank, I wanted to get your thoughts on that psychological safety and what you're doing within, you know, primarily the caregiver world, right? Because you've got the same thing where you've got the employees with, you know, potentially people, you know, outside the public coming in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. I mean, this is so complex, because if you think about even the COVID testing, you can test negative one day and then the next day test positive. So everybody wants an N95 mask. If you don't know what an N95 mask is by now, you haven't been watching the media, right? And so, you know, the factors I've talked about, the safety, the science, the physical, and then it's the supply, right? And so I don't know at Tracy at Levi's, but, you know, we struggle with the N95 supply, and that, you know, there has to be proper PPE for, you know, certain procedures. But then when you walk into our medical office building and you're in front of a clerk, we have the shield, but everybody wants that mask. So it gets into the psychological, because from what I've been told, this is not an airborne, this is more like a surface type of virus. And it's not in the air, and you touch a surface, you touch your mouth, what have you, you don't need a mask, but everybody wants a mask. And then the mixed messages, for example, in LA County, everybody has to wear a mask. So you're dealing with a lot of different messages. And for us, at least, you know, we've put in thermal monitors, we have temperature checking. We actually, in all of our buildings, we have disposable masks. And so we are asking we haven't had the employee refuse a mask yet, but we are giving everybody a mask when they walk into our buildings. Like I said, we're mailing over 200,000 cover your cough masks. So it's a very complex, and again, it's what kind of employer do you want to be? The one thing that we also did that is for our caregivers in the hospitals and the clinics, they're very concerned that they go into this environment and then they bring it home. But we've also offered hotel stipends so that they can self-quarantine and things of that nature. So there's a variety of strategies that we put in place because we've gotten feedback. I said we do pulse surveys, we did a COVID survey, so that feedback has been valuable. We can determine what are those strategies so that people feel safe in the work environment.
Thanks, Frank. Chris, I wanted to get everybody's perspective on this to kind of summarize and talk about the future workforce, right? Obviously, it changes weekly. Nobody really knows where it's going to land or what it's going to look like. But from your perspective, what is the one challenge that executives are going to face in trying to reopen an office, say 6 months from now? You know, let's not take the, you know, right now, but 6 months from now, what's one thing that executives should be evaluating and should have a plan for as far as reopening an office? Is it, you know, making sure that and, you know, a combination office potentially with, you know, the virtual workforce? Is it keeping that culture? Is it effective onboarding? You know, what's the one thing that people should be concerned about?
I think it's that blended experience, right? So some people will be in, less people will be in, but many will still be remote or working from anywhere, as Frank said. And I think being conscious of how do you upskill people in different soft skills and mitigating kind of disconnects when you're not all in the same room or in the same environment. You know, there's been a lot of talk about automation and artificial intelligence augmenting human beings, but as of 2018, there was more people over 65 than under 5 in the developed world. And so all of us are having to actually embrace new technologies to be more productive and actually meet the demands of our economies moving forward. So I think it will be reskilling, retraining, developing leadership skills around how do you coach people and lead them through. Again, this was a medical-driven digital transformation period, but how that actually will continue to be the challenge of adapting to change and helping people and training people through that change.
Thanks, Krista. Tracy, your thoughts on, you know, what's one of those things that people are going to be facing, the challenges in the future?
Yeah, so one thing I just want to, I think that we have spent a time in the last decade or more really thinking about, you know, kind of wellness as a function and employee wellness, and our benefits leaders have done a beautiful job of kind of leading us through that. And there's lots of practical reasons. And again, this is sort of Frank's world. So, but I actually think that I love, Frank, what you said, we have to live with this. And I think that could be a long time. And I don't think we'll actually do our jobs if, say, there's a vaccine and everything sort of goes back to the way it was, because we actually know that there's been a chronic health crisis in this country and around the world and parts of the country. There's been a mental health crisis. And so, and some of this is having a spotlight because working from home is actually stressing people out. There's anxiety about the virus, whether you're back on the front lines or you're home, but there's anxieties about your children's education, or, you know, just having, you know, just not seeing a lack of human contact, just starting to really, I think, come up. And, you know, we're seeing this in mental health. And so the thing that we're doing and what I have sort of deemed as our marker of success is certainly to think about our future workspace and work from everywhere and all those things, but really to think about well-being more holistically. And reason the word well-being, employee well-being, what is our role in that as an employer, whether it's psychological safety, physical health, mental health. And so as much as we're thinking about return to office, we're also thinking about, well, that's one tiny piece of a bigger piece around well-being. And that's the cultural piece that I hope all of us take on, because I think this is an opportunity to do that. And I think we're going to have to do it just because of all the uncertainty that our employees are going to be living with for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Tracy. And Frank, your perspectives on challenges within the next year that you're going to face.
Yeah, so I mean, I think everybody had some great points, and I would just say there's a lot of unknown. I would say have a strategy. Think about it as I mean, maybe just it's because what we talk about in 2, 6, and 12. And I say it that way because we have the flu season coming and they're talking about another surge, right? So let's say you bring everybody in and now here comes a surge, you gotta send everybody out. So think about it in a phase approach. Don't rush because there's a lot of unknowns, you know, especially with all the social unrest. Everybody's talking about another surge because people were out protesting and things of that nature without masks. So we don't know if there's going to be more infections or what have you. So I really think the challenge is that for executives are have a strategy and a framework so that you can approach this in a more of a phased approach rather than this is going to be my strategy, because this virus has really hit us all sideways and has created a lot of new, you know, cultural norms, a lot of new processes and ways of working and things of that nature. So I think the challenge is don't rush, be thoughtful, listen to your employees, and have a phased in approach, because I think it's cyclical. Like I said, we're living with this. And until we get a vaccine, we may have surges and things of that nature. So, you know, have a really good strategy, but really listen to your employees because they have some really good things to say.
Thanks, Frank. We are out of time. I really appreciate the conversation. This time went by extremely fast. And Tracy, Krista, and Frank, thank you so much for your perspectives and joining us. For those of you, next week, we'll have a session on June 19th with Pat Waters from ServiceNow. And I apologize we didn't get all of the questions. There's some great questions out there, and we will have a follow-up email where we can connect you with the panel if you want to ask your question and get their perspective. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thanks all. Be well.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.